All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. Good morning to everyone. I hope you all had a great weekend. We're back today talking some more InDesign. And actually, what we're going to end up talking a lot about is your final project for the class. So we're going to be working today on our portfolios. You'll get started there. And we'll start talking about InDesign with multi-page layouts, which is kind of the next big piece of InDesign. So it's something that will start today and will continue on for the rest of the semester. Let me go ahead and share my screen and then we'll walk over some of the requirements for it. So you should see my screen now, and I have pulled up assignment 107. This is due at the end of the semester. It's due on the Monday of that last week of finals, which will be December 5th. Just a little bit about it. Essentially, this is your final project for the class. And our whole point in doing this is to put all of your work to date together so that you have a body of work that you could show somebody that represents you as a designer. So this is probably the first portfolio you've ever put together, which is totally okay, and it won't be the last. When you're in a design field, portfolios are something that are very, very critical to getting jobs, showing clients, maybe showing different schools, classes, getting into a particular class. Your portfolio is really a representation of you and your creative abilities as a designer. So it's something that's very important to start developing early and often. And so this is really our first stab at it. It's hopefully going to end up being pretty good, but at the end, maybe it won't be that good and you'll end up redoing it. And that's also okay. So we're going to work our way through it. I'm giving it to you now. Recognize that it's just now October and it's not due until December. And so you could be thinking, well, wait a minute, how are we starting on the final already? Well, the truth is that this is something that I want you to work on and kind of chew over and keep iterating and making better for the next 2.5 months or so. We want to get this, the more time we have in development on this, the better it's going to be. So we're beginning today. And what we're going to do is collect all of your work. It can be from other classes. It can be from your work experience. Those are all valid sources. The only requirements for you in this portfolio is to put all of the assignments from this class into your portfolio. So those are just the big things. It's not your exercises, it's just the assignments. So as of today, you have assignment 101 and assignment 102 to put into your portfolio. Soon you'll have 103, and eventually you'll have 104, 105, etc. So there will be 6 assignments. Those need to be in your portfolio. If you're doing other work in other classes, think about considering those pieces and how you would bring those in. If you're in 121, for example, architecture class, think about getting your folding cubes in. Think about getting your Caldu Museum in. Think about getting your Mondrian Museum in. Those are all projects that you'll be working on. Maybe you've started, maybe you haven't yet in this semester. I'm not quite sure. Those are all things that belong in your portfolio. If you've already taken 120, for example, the intro class, maybe you have a design for your cabin, maybe that belongs in here. So that portfolio is fundamentally a living document, and we'll talk about that at length today during lecture, but the more that you put in, the better off you're going to be because you can always edit it back out. So we want to think a lot about the structure and organization, how we're going to lay out our information. And then in part 2 here, we will eventually, and we'll come back to this, once we do some more Illustrator work, we'll come back to a day where we work on just the cover in Illustrator. And so you'll make that cover for the portfolio. And finally, we'll revisit and finalize those layouts and get a final document together that you're going to be turning in. We won't be printing it this semester, so you'll only be turning in a digital PDF, which is actually kind of the way portfolios are going. It used to be a big deal to actually physically print a portfolio and be able to hand somebody something. But in this day and age, we're all expecting it to be electronic. So you should be used to creating a PDF and being able to give somebody that PDF. So, like I said, it's due on Monday, the 5th of December. So I know that seems like a long way out, but it's going to happen real quick. And be aware that this is a hard deadline. So once I say it's due, it's going to be due. And there aren't any exceptions for turning it in late, unlike other classwork where you can be late and take a little bit of a penalty. This is fundamentally due at the end of class. So let's do a little bit of discussion about portfolios in general. Let's see here. Of course, I have to get everything working. There we go. So let's talk about portfolios. and understanding what portfolios are fundamentally. Now, unfortunately, I don't have the luxury of giving you a bunch of portfolios to look at. When I used to teach this class in person, I'd take out old portfolios that students had left behind and I'd put them all on the back table, and you guys could go out and look through all those portfolios and get ideas. In this world, it's a little bit harder to do that, but there are, if you Google architecture portfolios, you can see examples, and I'm certainly going to show you examples in slide form today. I'll show you some student examples, I'll show you some other examples. But what is a portfolio? Well, fundamentally, a portfolio is designed to be the story of you. So we want to be telling who you are as a designer. So if somebody picks up that document or looks at it on a computer, looks at it on an iPad, they understand who you are fundamentally as a designer. So what is it that makes you work and tick and excited? Those are all important things for you to know and for you to convey through this portfolio. You don't want to be telling a different story. If you're really interested in something specific, let's say you're interested in designing zoos, and you show a whole portfolio of museums, well, those two don't go together. So you want to think about what it is that goes with you as the designer. What is it that you're interested in, and what do you like to do? You also, of course, want to think about what makes you unique and different than other designers. So we're going to go through some of the requirements. In a portfolio, you have to have some kind of an introductory page. So you can't just open the cover and jump right into the work. We need to have some kind of a title page or a table of contents page that, number one, identifies you as the designer. Number two, identifies the projects that are shown in this portfolio, and maybe contains some additional information about you or your background, or a brief introduction or something along those lines. So I have the slides over on the right side. I haven't talked specifically about these slides because I'll show them at length later, and we'll kind of talk about them when we're seeing the whole document put together. The other thing is that you have to keep your portfolio current. So you're always doing new design work, and that new design work needs to find its way in your portfolio. So I would say it's fundamentally a living document. It's something that's always being updated. As you finish a project, that new project goes into the portfolio and the oldest project drops out. So ideally, projects in your portfolio aren't going to be older than maybe 3 to 5 years. So we keep those older projects kind of falling off the back end, and you keep the newer projects alive and current. And it's part of you evolving as a designer, as you're showing that evolution. Also think about, what is the purpose of each project in your portfolio? Why is this particular project in here? So we want to avoid things like repetition. Let's say you're really, really good at 3D renderings. Well, if all you ever show is 3D rendering after 3D rendering, people are going to start to look at you as an artist rather than a designer, because all you're showing is, I'm really good at 3D rendering. So you want to show a diversity in your skill set. Some drawing, and by drawing, I don't necessarily mean hand drawing. I just mean drawing of floor plans or sketches or those kinds of pieces, 3D renderings, diagrams. We want to show a diversity in your skill set so that it's really representing you and your design ideas, not always just the final product. So this is the sticky part, and that's when you're in groups. And inevitably, in architecture school, in design school, you're going to do work in groups. And when you want to put group work in a portfolio, the key here is understanding what it is that you did as part of the group, rather than what the whole group did. So when you can, of course, let's say the whole group designed a couch or something. Well, of course, you're going to show pictures of the whole couch. But then you want to think about what it is that you designed specifically. What were you responsible for? What did you really put your time and effort into? And if you focus on your specific contribution, then that'll make sense as to why it is a group project and why it belongs in your portfolio. So what you want to remember is that people in your group are applying for the same jobs, the same schools, the same positions, the same scholarships that you are. And so if you're all showing the same body of work and not differentiating who did what, it's confusing to the people that are reviewing that information. So focus on what it is that you contributed to the group and make sure that that shows. I have a great example a little bit later on of some student portfolios, and we can look at how they resolved group work. A killer portfolio is also well designed. So the best portfolios out there have a really good, strong graphic basis behind them. So they have an understanding of flow lines and column intervals. The things that we talked about last class, those mechanics of graphic design, are in the background of these portfolios. So this on the right here is a perfect 3-column layout. And if we saw more of this, we'd start to see the flow lines appear. The other thing is that great portfolios take time to evolve. I like to tell the story about my grad school portfolio. And unfortunately, I used to physically have it so you could see it. I don't have it anymore. But the idea behind the grad school portfolio was, obviously to get into grad school in the first place. And so I started working on it long before the application was due, and I ended up producing 7 portfolios, 7 different portfolios. I've mentioned the first one before that had squares that were too small and you couldn't see anything. But I worked through iteration after iteration after iteration, trying to improve this portfolio to really represent who I was as a designer. And I'd go and seek up other people's opinions. I'd show it to a former teacher and ask what they thought, and they'd give me feedback, and I'd take it back and keep working on it. So really, really good portfolios take a long time to evolve because you have to keep working at them. And so our purposes in this class is we're starting now and we're trying to evolve that portfolio over 2.5 months. So we end up with a better product in the end. Actually, it's about 2 months. I shouldn't say 2.5. It's about 2 months. So remember to trust your intuition. Is this working? Is it not? That voice in the back of your head should help a lot. So let's talk specifically about some setup. Well, when we think about setup, we need to think about an inner versus an outer margin. And in this context, the inner margin generally is a little bit longer or bigger than the outer margin. And that's because a lot of times if we were to physically print this, we'd be putting some kind of a binding on the printer or on the booklet. And if we were to bind it, it's going to eat up to maybe 1/4 of an inch of that center as we do that binding. If you think about a spiral binding or a comb binding, those are all going to eat up some of the space in the middle of that portfolio. So we give a little bit of extra margin on there. And then on the outside, it's probably a little bit less. Then we have something called bleed. And this is that when you're printing multiple versions of a magazine or any kind of a book or whatever, they're going to print a bunch of pages together, and then they're going to trim the pages because the last thing they want is a little bit of white space around the outside of your image. So imagine for a second that you had a book or a magazine and you had a picture that went off the page. Well, if the printer printed it exactly where it was supposed to go, and then the trimmer went in and tried to trim the page exactly where it was supposed to go, there's a chance that we'd see a sliver of paper. If it wasn't quite straight or the printer was off just a little bit, we'd see a sliver of white on the edge of that image. And that little bit of sliver would really be distracting. So we allow something that's called bleed. And that means that we give an extra 1/8 of an inch of any image on the outside of what we want our final document to be to allow for that. So if it comes out of the printer a little crooked, that's still going to be okay. It's going to actually print all the way off the edge of the page. So we're going to set that for an 1/8 of an inch. And I'll show you how to do that in InDesign. And we're going to plan for that in our documents. Now, you're printing this one off. Maybe you're going to trim well, you're actually not even printing this. But if we were to print it, you'd be printing it 1 page at a time, and you could very carefully trim the edges of the page to make sure that this didn't happen. But it's just a good habit to get into whenever you're making this kind of a booklet. We're also going to make sure that we're choosing CMYK mode for printing. That is our color space for printing. We'll talk a lot about color space going forward, but we're going to be in CMYK mode, and I'll show you how to make sure that that is set correctly in your InDesign file. So let's look at it here in a little bit more detail. So obviously this is set up like a normal book would be set up. But what we have is we have double the inner margin. Oops, how am I in black? I should be in red. There we go. So we have a 1/2 inch on each side of the page there. And the outer margin is a 1/4 of an inch. We have and that's the dashed line. We have what's called our trim line right there. That's the actual edge of the page that we want. And then we have an extra 1/8 of an inch, this border around here at the very top, on the sides right over here, and at the bottom right over here that goes all the way around the page. That extra little bit of a trim line is called the bleed edge. That's how much extra image we're going to have, just in case something were to go wrong when we create it. So we have our trim line, that's the actual edge of the page, and then we have our bleed, that's the extra page or the extra image that goes off the page, just in case we have troubles during printing. So let's look at some examples, and then we're going to actually go into InDesign and set some of this stuff up. I'm going to use Alex Holgraph's examples because I think they're absolutely fantastic. Alex Holgraph is a visual artist. So what he does is he takes design work for other people and produces drawings and renderings for those firms or people. So he's incredibly good at it, creates beautiful drawings. He does plenty of his own work as well, but this is kind of his realm. And so using his as examples is great because he has such high quality images and you can really see how they come together in portfolios. He does several different portfolios, or he has many different ones. This is actually an older one, but I think it's a good one to kind of explain some of the ideas that we've been talking about. The other thing about it is if you want to see more of his work, his website is visualizingarchitecture.com. You can go there and see all kinds of his work, and I think it's a great source of inspiration. This is actually the full cover. So it's designed to fold in two places, there and there. So if you imagine this is the front, this is the spine, and this is the back cover of the portfolio. And that's how it kind of plays out. So this is what it would look like if it was printed, where it folds around the page. So let's look. Remember that first page that we talked about? And this is, in this case, it's a spread. Remember, all of these are clipped right here. So they would fold together like a book. That would be the binding. And so on that first page, we have a little bit of extra information about him. So he has his website right there. And obviously this is fake text, but this would be a little descriptor about who he was or whatever. Then he has a table of contents. And then he has brief descriptions about what each of the projects are. And then he also has this a little graphic here. And this is a nice little addition. This is a touch, where he has a little symbol that represents this particular project. And we'll see that symbol repeat over time. So let's look at the first page here of his layout. So we can start to see things established. One, that symbol that I was just talking about is showing up in the upper corners of the page. There it is in both pages. So we understand where this project belongs in the scheme of projects. This could be done with just page numbers as well, but in this case, he's doing it graphically. He's used our rule of thirds, right? Where we have, let's call it about a quarter of the page here. And we've got 3/4 of the overall spread right there. This is, of course, where the spine would be, where the dividing line would be. Right, so he's using that compositional technique. We see what's starting to become a flow line appearing right across the page there. And we have this division right here. So you can start to see graphically how this is playing out. Now let's go to the next page. So we've flipped over, but we can see that that flow line is kind of still continuing. So we have it right here. As we go over, that flow line continues right there. So he's working in the same kind of general vocabulary. He needed a little bit more space for his drawing on the left side here. So this is actually a little bit more than a quarter. This is maybe a third, oops, and 2/3. But it's still within the same vocabulary where he's breaking up the page. Now for me, I think this might have been a little bit stronger if he flipped these two. If you took the text and put that on the outside and took this image and put it toward the inside. That's a personal opinion, but I think it might have felt a little bit better. We're continuing. We're in a different project now. So a little bit different design vocabulary, but those symbols are showing up in the upper corner. So we're seeing that, yes, this is different. The fonts are consistent page to page. The sizes are consistent. The hierarchy is still established. And in this example, we're seeing the flow line flipped. The flow line is now appearing down here at the bottom of the page. All right. This is also dividing right here. So we have our 1/4, 3/4, even though they're on opposite pages. So we're seeing that vocabulary repeat itself. As we move forward, right, now our line went up to the top of the page. Oops, helps if I can draw there. Can't draw, there it is. Right, there's our flow line. This is more like the second page that I showed. This is a 1/3, 2/3. But it's still kind of the same vocabulary. Font sizes are the same. Those are all critical components to developing a strong vocabulary here. We move forward. This is more of a traditional 3-column layout. So we don't have that strong flow line anymore. It's just divided up into columns, and that's because more of these drawings need to appear on the page. And so we always have to think about intelligently breaking the framework that we've set up. So in this case, he has his section views on the left, and he has his plan views on the right. Oops. There we go. Another example here. The flow lines shifted up, but we still have, in this case, it's the 1/4, 3/4 division. And so this is a really good example of a page where we have just all graphic renderings. And so how do we divide that up? One of the things that I've seen students do frequently is they end up having images that collide together. Alex has left just a little bit of white space. It's not too much, just a little bit of white space in between these images to highlight the image and to give them the space that they need to read. So I frequently see in portfolios images that are either squished together completely with no space or images that are way too far apart. Those are all critical things to think about when you're looking at these renderings and designs, is how do we highlight them? So if I were looking at this page, I actually wouldn't notice the space very much. Obviously, I'm pointing it out right now, but it's fundamentally about the renderings. And I get involved and I get interested in what's going on these renderings, and I want to look at the images. The best graphic design is the kind that just goes away and you don't notice it anymore. All right, so let's look at a different example. Oops, there we go. Here's our first page. So in this context, they've chosen to have their table of contents here. Again, we have page numbers going down, a little bit of a description about what each of these projects are, and then they have a kind of a simple graphic that represents those projects. You don't have to have the simple graphic. That's just sometimes the design strategy. Now, on the left side of this page, this particular person has included kind of a resume. And so sometimes that's important. The nice thing about including a resume in this is that it's all in one document. So if somebody's evaluating you for a job position or whatever, the resume is included. So it might be something that you want to include. It's not required by any means to include it. I think kind of the minimum is kind of your name and some contact information. I do want to point something out right here under the skills section. He's identified all this different software, and then he's given himself a bar scale of abilities in this. Well, this is a terrible idea. And I don't know who this person was, but I like to point this stuff out when I see it. The last thing you want to do is say, I'm only okay at this, or I'm only okay at that. You want to present yourself as being 100% fluent and amazing in every one of those pieces of software. So it'd be far better to have a paragraph that says fluent in AutoCAD, Revit, Photoshop, Illustrator, InDesign, Rhino, Grasshopper, and SketchUp. That's much better than having this little graphic bar scale saying, I'm not very good at Rhino, but maybe you should still hire me. That's just not a good strategy. So think about that as something that if you're working on a resume, you don't want to show this as an example. But his layouts are actually very, very strong. And we can start to see this setting itself up page after page. We do have a nice flow line starting to be established. He's used this little bar at the bottom here, and then like a footnote that explains like what this was. So we're seeing that consistency. We have page numbers over here. We have a great font choice that has a nice hierarchy. And then we get to a smaller font choice down here. Let's look at another page. Oh, apparently I don't have another page, but you get the idea. Another example of a portfolio. So here's our table of contents. No drawings whatsoever. We just have page numbers and what the projects are. So there's nothing wrong with this either. I think it would be nice to have a little bit of information right over here that identified who the person was, contact information, etc. So this person chose to put the resume on the next page. Again, resume not required. So here's one of his pages or her pages, kind of graphically. So this is full color, and then you're using a little bit of text to kind of identify things. A couple things to think about in this example. right? One, the primary content, right? I'm assuming that this person is designing this black blob is the library, okay? Well, this looks fantastic when we're looking at it right now. But if we imagine this folded, where this right there is the spine, the project is folded in half and is right in the very bottom of that spine. So it's difficult to see. So think about taking that and moving it over so it falls right over here. Or move it the other direction so that it falls right over here. Make sure that it's in the middle of one of the pages, and then follow that rule of thirds to kind of set it up, just like we would in a photography layout. So in this example, we have a consistency of columns. So we've got a column, a column, a column, a column, right? There, I would argue that this is a column and this is a column, they're just empty. So we're seeing that repetition of columns, and it's going to happen again on the next page. And it helps to have these long, skinny floor plans because you can stack them next to each other. But this is fundamentally kind of how they're setting up content. We have a little bit of a flow line appearing on the bottom. That's probably consistent on some of these previous pages. Yeah, the content is kind of right at the bottom there. I would argue that that should go up a little bit. This should go up just a little bit so we can continue that flow line page to page. So this is Bashir's portfolio. Bashir was in your shoes, oh boy, probably 8 years ago, maybe something like that. And so he went through the same stuff you did at DVC. He actually came back to give one of the lectures last spring, which was pretty fun. And so now he's an accomplished architect. So he started where you were, but this is his portfolio at the time. And so this is giving you an idea of what a student portfolio can be. This was his cover. This was his first page. So in this case, he didn't have information about himself, partly because that was on the cover, but he does have his index or table of contents, and then he has his introduction, he's got his projects, digital fabrication, and he's got some stuff that he calls theory at the end. So this is his introductory page. It shows some of his sketches, and it also talks about who he is, etc. He has the luxury of an infinite number of pages, so he didn't have to worry about that. But then we move on to some of his projects. So this is the Mondrian Museum that he did in 121. These are his sketches relating to that Mondrian Museum and thinking about what the design would be. So he's leading with a page of sketches and then following with process and then finally some actual elevations. So we're seeing those start to come together. If I were being nitpicky, I'd fix a few things. This indent is too far. I think the spacing, this image should line up with the image below it. So this one needs to come over. So there's a few little things that could be tweaked and improved. But generally speaking, I think this is a nice layout. Notice that he does have some consistency. This kind of division here is happening on the next page as well. There's that same division there. He's got the 2/3, 1/3. So this would be a 1/3, this would be a 2/3. And he's trying to use that to his advantage here. That was the Calder Museum. Then he gets to this thing called the Serpentine Pavilion, which is something that he and a bunch of other students worked on. And so because this is a group project, remember we talked about the awkward nature of group projects, he comes out with the Serpentine Pavilion and then he lists all the names. Nothing wrong with listing his name first. It also helps that alphabetically it would be first. But he's coming right out and saying, hey, this is a group project. So then as we move forward, we've got some general information about the group and what they were trying to create and some of the general drawings. And then we get to what he was really responsible for, this process and assembly, the code that had to do with the Arduinos and the lighting systems and whatever. This is what he was passionate about. This is what he did as part of his group contribution. So he emphasized that part of this rather than just the whole project. So a little bit about the project and then an emphasis on the part that he contributed, the part that he made. And then we continue on into some of his renderings. He did this in 136. So let's move on to another student. Another example here of an architecture portfolio for a student. A little bit different color. I think he did a particularly nice job on his font choices and kind of creating and establishing a strong hierarchy on pages using fonts. So he organized this a little bit differently. He has a first year design, second year tech, and then personal exploration. So it's just set up a little bit differently. I like to lead, if I'm establishing a portfolio, I like to lead with best project first, followed by second best, third, etc. So what they see in the beginning is the absolute best work I've ever done. So it's just a different strategy for how you lay things out. So here's some of his pages. These were not designed to be spreads. So they don't fold open. They're individual pages that are glued together. That's why I set these up a little bit differently on each page. And you can see that there's a consistency to them. The title is showing up right there every time on every page. We have a little bit of subtext. So this line here matches up with that line. So there's a consistency, page after page after page, even though the images are moving around. There we are again, right? Same location for the titles, same location for the little blurbs about the titles. So there's this consistency to each page. The font choices are the same. The flow lines are the same. And he's using that to his advantage as he establishes every one of these pages. So this, to me, really is a great layout because the layout becomes not important and you focus on the content. So as I flip through each one of these pages, you start to see the content rather than the layout because it's so consistent and so expected. Right? Now, occasionally, you end up breaking it. So the title's over here in the first page. Remember, this is the second page of this project. So he no longer needs the title. And guess what? That's where this gets broken. There is still on each page, you know, the 1/3, 2/3. Same thing here. Even though that this is primarily text, our drawing naturally ends at that 2/3 line and the text is in the 1/3 line. And he's got a little bit of sketches up here. This is a really nice layout for showing different pages. So of course, I'll show more, but you can also Google architecture portfolios to see more examples of it. There's a couple links here for some portfolio design tips, etc. So you're more than welcome to look at that. Visualizing Architecture, I mentioned, is an absolute great website. You can see Alex Holgraph's stuff. I'm going to go ahead and jump out of the lecture here. And just for fun here, I'm going to bring up the Visualizing Architecture. So this is Alex Holgraph's work, and you can see all of his visualization projects. He's just an incredible artist, right? And so here's Portfolio Volume 5, and he actually sells his portfolios. But you can actually look through and see some of his work. Come on, let me see. And how he sets up his various pages. Like that. Okay, so he's got lots of examples. You can see there's his various pages, etc. So if this is something that you're interested in or just want to spend a little bit of time browsing, there's no problem with that. He also does have tutorials that kind of walk through various examples. He kind of writes how he gets to a particular category, how he's thought through what he's creating, his different versions of it, etc. So I'd encourage you to spend some time looking at that website because he has all kinds of great information. And if you just need some inspiration, that's always a good plan. Okay, so let's talk about InDesign. I'm going to go ahead and open up InDesign here. I have to give it a little bit of time. Perfect. I'm going to close the splash screen here. And we're going to create a new document. So I'm not going to just pick one of the presets. I'm going to go into more presets so that we can actually set something up. So I had a couple students who struggled with units before. I'm going to change my units right here into inches so I can actually see it. And I'm going to start with an 8.5 by 11 page. And for me personally, I like to see it in landscape format. Somehow that just works better in my portfolio, in my mind. That's what it feels like. If you want to do a different size, you wanted to do a square portfolio, etc., you can choose any size here. I would keep it smaller, 8.5 by 11 or smaller. So we're not looking for a portfolio of 24 by 36s or 11 by 17s. So 8.5 by 11 or smaller is kind of what we're looking at. It should approximate a physical book that you could hand to somebody. Below that, we have the ability to add pages. We're going to start with just one page, but I'll end up adding them later. And then we have a check mark here for facing pages or not. And so this has to do with whether you want to have a spread where the portfolio opens like a book and you have content on the left page and content on the right page, or whether you want to just have a series of pages that one after the other. This used to be something that was a big decision because you were thinking about how you were going to print and bind your portfolio. When I was applying to grad school, I told you that before, there was a limit on the number of physical pages that could be in your portfolio. So I think it was 12. And so you could, if you did back and front of each page, you got 24 pages. So it became something that was important. Now that more of the portfolios are coming in digital format, we don't see as much of facing pages because you're not really viewing the spread anymore. You're viewing one side or the other, depending on how you create it. There is, of course, a way when you export to export the spread, so you see the whole page rather than the individual pages. But a lot of times people are starting to, with the digital portfolios, uncheck this box, so we just have a series of pages that are one after the other. Gregorio's, the one that I showed you in lecture just a minute ago, his was where this was unchecked. You just had one page after the other. And that works really nicely in a PDF format. So that's a choice that you have to make when it comes to designing your book. I'm going to leave it checked for facing pages just so I can explain a little bit more about facing pages, but know that I think that's kind of the direction we're leaning, where this would get unchecked and you just have one page after the other. Okay, so we're going to come down here. I'm going to ignore columns for right now, and I'm going to look at my margins. Remember, we talked about the inside margin needing to be larger than the outside margin. I'm going to unlink these together, and that's going to allow me to change the top margin. I'm going to do it at 0.25, the bottom at 0.25. The inside I'm going to stick at 0.5, and the outside I'm going to stick at 0.25. Now I'm going to scroll down, and you can see that we previously stopped at margins and that was it. But guess what? Below that we have something called bleed. Remember, this is that extra space. So we want the bleed all the way around to be at 1/8 of an inch, which is 0.125 inches. However, the inside, because this is facing pages, we don't want the inside to have a bleed because it's going to be in that, basically in the binding. So I'm going to uncheck or unchain these together, and I'll set my inside bleed at 0. Right, like that. So top, bottom, and outside would be 0.125. Now, if we had our facing pages unchecked, we'd have a top, bottom, left, and right all at 1/8 of an inch. So that's it for our setup. And at that point, I can go ahead and say create. And that's going to build my document. So if we look at my document, I have a margin that's a little bit bigger on the left side here than it is everywhere else. And I also have this red line that goes all the way around, and that represents my bleed. So if I have an image that's going all the way off the page, I want to make sure that that lays out so that it goes all the way out to that point. Now let's take a look at pages. So thus far, we've looked primarily at properties. The next tab over is for pages. And so if we look at our pages, we have up here, we have something called parents. We'll talk about that in just a second. And below that, we have our page 1. And we notice that there's a binding here, and we have page 1. If I were to come to the bottom of this little window and click on the plus sign to create a new page, I'd get a new page that's on the left. If I clicked on it again, I get a new page that's on the right. So you see, now we're getting the first page of the book, and then we're getting the second and third page. In the interest of being fair and showing both examples, I'm going to go ahead and create another new file here. Let me save this one first, and I'll put it in my flash drive. And this is facing pages. And then let me go to File and then New Document. And we're once again going to go in inches. I'm going to choose the 8.5 by 11 in landscape. I'm going to uncheck facing pages. We're going to make sure that my margins are the same all the way around. So we'll change my left margin to 0.25. We'll scroll down to my bleed here, and that's also going to be 0.125. And then I can create. So this is good because it shows us two examples, right? When I have this example here, my non-facing pages, when I go ahead and create my next page, it'll just show up as the next page down. My third page, next page down. 1, 2, 3. So we have these different setups where we have the spread and our pages are laid out like that, or we have this example where we just have consecutive pages. So it's just a different strategy for how you're presenting your work. And I don't care which strategy, that's something for you to decide. So in either case, whether we're in the facing pages or we're in my second example here with consecutive pages, we're going to skip the first page because that's where our cover is going to go. And we're going to start our layouts on the second page. So in this case, it would be the second and third page. In this case, it would just be the second page down here. So we want to think about how do we start to create this layout? And we can, like you've seen before, we can actually drag guides. So I could start to establish, where was that, if I wanted to do a 2/3, 1/3 setup, I could drag this guide over and create that. The problem is that this guide only shows up on this one page, right? So let's say that I wanted it right there. I'm holding down Shift so it jumps to my points, and there it is. But it's not showing up on any further pages. So I have page 2 and 3. Let me click the plus sign to create page 4 and 5. And that guide that I just created on page 3 doesn't show up on page 5. So I'd have to come down to page 5 and create it again. This is where parents come in. And so these used to be called masters, but now they're called parents. Adobe has changed the name for it. So you may hear in a previous lecture of mine, or you may see online in other lectures that there are references to masters. Just know that they've been changed to, the name has been changed to parents. And what the parent does is the parent allows us to put content or guides or frames or information on a page and then apply it to multiple pages. So let's come up here into our parents. I'm actually going to drag it down so we can see more of the parent section here. And I'm going to create a new parent. I'm going to right click and say new parent. This is going to be the B parent. And I'll go ahead and say OK. And it'll say B parent. And then I will double click up here to make sure that I'm on the parents. Right there. I could actually press Control minus here just to zoom out a little bit. And now what I create on this page is going to apply to multiple pages. So let's say that I created that guide for myself. So I came over here and I put that guide in there. And maybe I wanted to put the guide in over here as well. So I'll come over here and I'll put the guide in over there because they're facing. So I put those two guides in place. If I want those guides to appear on these other pages, so we'll come down here to our pages 2 and 3. There they are. Let's delete this because it was on the page. There we go. Notice in the upper left and right corner of these pages, I have a little A listed. That's the A parent. That's what's been applied. If I take these two pages, I'm going to hold down Shift, select them both, and I'll right click and say apply parent to pages. And I can say, you know what, instead of the A parent, I want the B parent. When I do that, those two lines that I created on the B parent will show up on these pages. I can come down to page 4 and 5. And likewise, I can right click on them and say apply parent to pages. And I can say, you know what, I want the B parent applied. Oops, excuse me. There it is. And there's my guide showing up. If I came back up to B parent and I said, you know what, I'm also going to divide and put my flow lines in. If I'm inside the page, it will just create the guide on the page. If I'm outside, it'll create the guide flowing all the way across both pages. So let's pull this down. Let's go right there. And I'm also going to give myself a guide down here. Oops, and that should have been outside. Sorry. Let's drop this outside. And there it is. So I've created those guides to help myself out a little bit. And so now on all these pages, page 2 and 3, page 4 and 5, everything that I've created is now on the page. The other advantage is that I can't actually select anything that's on the master when I'm on the pages, when I'm on the parent, because the content is on the parent, it's not on the master. So let's jump up here into my Be Parent again, and let's actually put something on here so we can see this. I could put a frame that went right there. Oh, come on. Sorry, my mouse doesn't want to cooperate this morning. Let me adjust that size just a little bit. So it lines up right there. And then I could create another one that was on this page, for example. Like that. And so now I have the two frames. Those two frames that I just created are now on pages 2 and 3 and pages 4 and 5. If I wanted to place content into one of those, remember, I don't want to place the content here. If I place the content up here, let's just say, for example, file, place, and we dropped this on. There it is. That's going to show up on page 2 and page 4. And I'm not going to be able to select it and get rid of it on any of these pages because it's on the parent. So the content needs to go on the pages themselves. The layout can go on the parents and then be applied to various layers. So you could have a whole series of parents that represented different layouts that you were reusing over and over again. Sometimes you just want to use the guides. And that's the truth is, for me, when I'm working, generally speaking, I just set up my guides and then I create my frames on the individual pages as I start to work with my layouts. So let's think about adding some text on these pages. And I'm going to go ahead and delete these frames for right now. Oh, by the way, if we had that frame down here, even though you can't select it, I can still use it to place content. So I could go to File and then Place. I could pick a particular piece of content, and when I go over this frame, it's going to stick it into that frame, even though the frame is not selectable. So I can right-click, go to Fitting, Fill Frame Proportionally, and there it is. So let's jump back up here onto my parent. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that, like I said, because I don't like it to be there. And I'll come back down onto pages 2 and 3, and I start to think about my content. So if I were laying this out, it's time to start thinking about text. So we can work with my type tool here. And I could create a text box like this. Notice that I'm not putting the text up on the parent layer because I don't want the same text to apply to every layer. So instead, I'll go ahead and type in what I want. So this might be contents. And I want to think about my font choice. So let's go into my properties. Let's go in and change this to Arial. And I'm using Arial because it has a variety of different thicknesses. And you know what? Let's do this in capitals. And let's increase the size here. Oops. I'll do it at 18. And then I'm going to move this down a bit like that. We'll move this up a bit. And we'll drop that to right there. And then I'll come back with my type tool. We'll create another box down here. Actually, I might do 2. I might do one that does the page numbers. And we'll do a different, this will again be an Arial. But we're going to do an Arial, let's see. Let's do Arial regular, and we'll do it at 10. No, let's stick with 12. And so this would be I have 103 point. Sorry. And let's see, this would be, oh, come on. There it is. All right. So 03, and then we could go down a couple lines, and this would be 05, 07. I'm making this up as we go. I have no idea how many pages certain things are going to be on. I have to come back and make those adjustments. But I can put the page numbers there, and then I could come over here next to it. I'm going to go ahead and copy this. So let's go to copy. I'll go to edit and then paste. We'll bring this over like that. I'll make this come out to there. And so this maybe is 02, 03. The introduction. This would be project 1, etc. So you see how I'm starting to set this up. If I wanted to view what this looked like without all of the lines and guides, I can go up to my view menu, and I could go to, excuse me, I could go over here into my screen mode, and I could switch from normal to preview, and I'll see what that looks like without all of the lines around it. So let's go back. That's under view, screen mode. We'll go back to normal. And for me, this needs to go up just a little bit more, like that. And then we'd come in here, and let's see, this would be project 3, project 2, project 3, project 4, etc. Now, when I say 1, 2, 3, and 4, I'm saying this should be a name, so maybe it is instead best photograph. It's combining images, lecture series poster, or whatever. You get the idea. So I'm working to set that stuff up. Then I come down here and I continue. And realistically, it's not 04 to 07. It's probably just 04. Maybe this is 05. And this is 06. You get the idea. Okay, so we'd be editing this. Now, in the same vein, maybe it's time to use this same setup. And over here on the right side, maybe I put more information about myself. So let's take this. I'm going to copy it, Control C, followed by Control V. There it is. We'll drop that right there. And this time, let's change my justification so that's justified to the right. Helps if I can type my own name, right? There we go. And maybe I want, just like this one, drop that there. We'll change my justification to the right. And let's change here, and let's put in or something like that. Now that text box was obviously too big, so we'll shrink it down so that it falls up on that page. But I'm using this same guide to kind of set up my work here. So let me go back to my, we'll go to view, and then we'll go to screen mode preview, and we can see what that looks like and how it's been set up. So this is designed to be an evolution. So I don't know what all the projects are yet, but I kind of work through putting that together. I put my name on the page. Okay, let's then think about our next, actual page. So we go on to page 4. This was our best photograph. This is where we'd be putting our best photograph on that page. So maybe we set this up in a similar manner. Let's go to view. Let's go to screen mode. Let's go back to normal. There it is. I'm going to use these same text boxes here. Let me copy. I'll come down on this page. I'll paste them. We'll drop those in so that they're appearing right there. And I was calling this best photograph. And so this maybe needs a little bit of description about the photograph. And since I don't have anything to kind of work with, I'm going to change the size of my text box here like that. And then I'm going to go up to type. And if we come down here, I can go to fill with placeholder text. And the advantage there is that it fills this with a placeholder text so that I can kind of have something that is like, yeah, someday I'll write a description for that. But I can see what it looks like graphically. And I can tell you right now that the font looks way too big. So I would take this and let's come over here and let's drop that to maybe 10 point. Much better. And so that just is giving us a little example, a little taste of what this would look like. I've laid it out. Now it's time to insert my best photograph. So it's time to create a frame. So I'd start with creating a frame. Remember, I want the frame to go all the way to the bleed lines. I want to give myself a little bit of a gap here. So I could use my align tools. Let me go up to window and then choose align. So it's under object and layout and then align. Remember, we did this last class here. And I'm going to use a spacing of a 1/16 of an inch. So 0.0625. You could use an eighth at 0.125. And I'm going to select both of those objects. I'll pick this as my key object, and then I'll distribute the spacing so that we have a 1/16 of an inch of space right there. Then I'll go ahead and I'll adjust this frame so that it comes back to the seam of our 2 pages, and then I'll drop this in. So I'll go to File and then Place, and I'll drop in my best photograph. Let's use this one. There it is. I'm going to right click on it, go to Fitting, I'll choose Fill Frame Proportionally, and there's that particular photograph. So if we went back to my View menu and I went to Screen Mode and I went to Preview, we'd see it with my text, we'd see it with my image, and now that's my first page. To me, this is probably a little bit close at a 1/16 of an inch. I think it needs a little bit more space. So let's go ahead and take these guys again. Actually, I only need 2 of them. Let's take this and this. I'll go back to my distribute spacing. Let's go to an 8.125, and we'll distribute them over. There it is. And then this needs to come back again to that edge. Now that spacing feels much better. So let's go ahead and go back to my view. We'll go to screen mode, and we'll go to normal. Now, you don't have to have a bunch of text, but I think a lot of times a little bit of an explanation is a good strategy. Now we could start to make this more complex. So I've kept the layout relatively simple so far, but maybe we want to fill the part where the text is with kind of a transparent color background or something. So we could do that up on the master. So we could come back up to my B parent, excuse me, I always call it a master because that's what it used to be called. And I could actually choose to fill, right, that region with a particular color. So I could come in here, we could create a rectangle. Go right like this. I don't want it to have a stroke color. I want it to have a fill color. And that fill color right now is black, but let's change the color to maybe 60% gray. There it is. And then I could adjust the opacity. Let's go to properties. Let's come up here to opacity, and let's say, let's make that, I don't know, let's make it 20%. It's kind of a light gray in color. And that didn't quite snap to that line. Let's make sure it's on the line. There it is. So this is now going to apply to these pages. So you can see it listed right there. You can see it showing up as a gray right there. And now that I've done that, maybe these texts need to go over a little bit. We're evolving as we go along. The advantage here is that I could actually have the image go behind, right? So if I were to pull this image over, the image could go behind. The problem at this moment is that this object is not in front. And we can do that using our layers. So if I go up to Window and then choose Layers, we haven't dealt with layers in InDesign just yet, but I can create a layer for the master, or excuse, for the parent. So let me call this parent. can't type this morning. Parent layer. We'll go ahead and say okay. And I can take this object and put it up on the parent layer, which means it's always going to be on top of everything else. So at that point, we could come back to our text here, and it's actually on top of my text. So I'd have to take my two text objects there and there, and let's create another layer for text. We'll put those text objects on the text layer, and then we'll put the text layer on top of the parent layer. There we go. So we're starting to layer this. Again, the advantage is that now, sorry, this and this should be on top of, this should be on the text layer so that they're on top there. And it's really hard to see that the gray is in fact on top of this photo. Maybe I need to pick a different photo or change this so that you can kind of see it better. Let me do this with it. And let's change the photo. That was not what I meant to do. Sorry about that. Trying to change this to a color. Yeah, you can see it's slightly doing it. If I went back to my pages, sorry, this is going to end up being awful, but right, let's say I dyed it a pink. You can actually see the pink going over the top of the photo, should you want it to do that. That's how we would set up those layers. This is ending up turning out terrible. So I'm going to back up here for a second, and let's go back to my simpler space here, where we're back to this. I'm going to get rid of that text box altogether. There we go. So I'm back to this setup. Now, what about if I want to put page numbers on a page? Well, InDesign does have the ability to automatically put page numbers on a page for you. So you would do it up in the parent. We would add a text box for the page number. And instead of typing in the page number, we go up into the type menu. We'd insert a special character, and we'd go to markers and then choose current page number. And because we're on the B parent, it shows up as a B. So let's change the font just like we would. Let's go to Arial, and let's do an Arial. Sure, we'll do an Arial bold. Sure, it can be in 12 point. Let's make sure it's aligned to the left. And then let's drop this all the way down here. I'm using the arrow keys to kind of nudge it like that. So that then is on the left page. I need to copy this. So we'll go to Edit, Copy, and then Edit, Paste. And we'll drop it over on the right page. But I have to change my layout just a little bit. There it is. Because this needs to be justified to the right. Now we also want these to line up correctly. So let me go to Control 0 so we can zoom out a little bit. I'm going to hold Shift, select them both. I'll pick this as my key object, and I'll make sure that they're both aligned to the same place, which they are. And so now if I went back to my pages, and when we went to page 2 here, you're going to see a 2. If we go to page 3, you're going to see a 3. If we go to page 4, you're going to see a 4. You go to page 5, we're going to see a 5. Now the magic of this, let's say that we added 2 more pages, 6 and 7, is if we change the order of the page. Let's say, you know what, page 4 really needs to come down here. Let's put it right there. Well, guess what? Now it's page 6, but the page numbers change too. So you can reorganize your page structure really nicely later on if you've done your page numbers in this capacity. Now, that's assuming you want page numbers. But I like to introduce that at least as a concept going forward. So we have our kind of general layout. We've kind of thought through how we want our layouts to go. What I'm asking you to do today is to try to get a little bit of a preliminary setup on your intro page, and then try to set up your first set of pages. You've got your best photograph, you've got your combining images. Try to put those 2 on pages and see how they start to lay out. If you have other content from other classes, 121, 220, etc., bring that content in, 120. See if you can work with some of your existing content to start to establish a basic portfolio. So going forward in the check-ins, probably not today because you won't have a chance to actually work with this too much yet, but I do want you to start thinking about it, and then we're going to start looking at your portfolios during check-ins. So as you're working on it, it's a way of kind of keeping you honest, keeping you working on it. Be prepared, maybe starting on Wednesday, to start showing your work, and then we'll start critiquing it. We'll start making it better. Okay? Before I let you go, do you guys have any questions? I know we're going to have our check-ins. We'll start in another 10 minutes, 9:15 or so. We'll start with our check-ins. But does anybody have any questions globally first?
Since I'm currently driving to another class right now, I wanted to ask, I sent you an email last night.
Yes, I got it, but I didn't have a chance to respond yet.
Okay,
So,
I just wanted to make sure you saw it, but I just wanted to explain some things.
I got it. I get it. Why don't you drive safely? I'll respond to the email, and if you still have questions, we'll talk later.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right, no problem.
Have a good day.
You too. Any other questions? No, perfect. All right, I'll let you guys go, and I'll see my first group in check-ins in about 10 minutes.